Edward Harrington sat in his study, surrounded by the kind of opulence only a lifetime of unrelenting ambition could create. The grand windows of his Los Angeles estate offered a breathtaking view of the city, below a sprawling, glittering network of life and energy. Yet, Edward felt none of it. At 50 years old, he had everything most people could ever dream of: immense wealth, unmatched influence, and a name that commanded both respect and fear in the world of business. But as Edward gazed out at the city, a pang of emptiness gnawed at him, a hollow ache that no amount of money or power could fill. He had built empires, toppled competitors, and achieved everything he set his mind to, and yet, as the years passed, he realized that all his accomplishments felt incomplete. It wasn't companionship he sought. He had been through 2 failed marriages, both of which ended in bitterness and disillusionment. His ex-wives had loved his fortune, his status, but never the man behind the empire. Love, Edward had concluded long ago, was a dangerous gamble, one he had no interest in playing again. No, what Edward longed for was something far more profound: an heir. Someone who would carry his name, his legacy, and everything he had built long after he was gone. An heir would give meaning to all the sacrifices he had made, a sense of permanence in an otherwise fleeting existence. Exercise 14. He leaned back in his leather chair, running a hand through his silver hair as he replayed the words of his late father, spoken decades ago. Edward, legacy isn't just about wealth, it's about leaving something behind that truly matters. Those words had stayed with him, haunting him in ways he could never admit. Edward had everything, but he had no one. No child to inherit his world, no family to share his triumphs. The thought of his vast fortune being divided among distant relatives or lost to charity filled him with an unshakable dread. This was why he had made his decision a practical, calculated solution to a deeply personal void. Love was unpredictable and messy, but legacy? Legacy was tangible, something he could control. He didn't need romance or a traditional marriage. He needed an agreement, a partnership, someone who could give him a child without the entanglements of emotion. Edward rose from his chair and walked to the window, his reflection staring back at him like a ghost. The lights of the city shimmered in the distance, but all he saw was his own solitude. "It's time," he muttered to himself, his voice low and resolute. "Time to secure my legacy before it's too late." The bustling sounds of clinking plates and muffled chatter filled the upscale restaurant in downtown Los Angeles. Edward Harrington rarely dined out, preferring the solitude of his estate, but tonight was different. He needed a distraction, a brief escape from the suffocating thoughts of legacy and loneliness. The restaurant was one of the finest in the city, known for its exclusivity and impeccable service, a perfect reflection of his taste. Edward sat at a corner table, his posture as composed as ever. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, he exuded an aura of quiet authority. A glass of vintage red wine rested in his hand, untouched, as his gray eyes scanned the room absently. At that moment, Claire Bennett entered the scene, weaving her way through the crowded dining area. At 28 years old, she was a waitress at the restaurant, working double shifts to make ends meet. Her worn shoes and tired smile were concealed by the polished uniform she wore, but the fatigue in her green eyes couldn't be hidden. Claire's life had been a constant struggle, her days consumed by endless work, and her nights by worry for her mother, whose mounting medical bills weighed heavily on her. As Claire balanced a tray of drinks, her mind raced with thoughts of overdue payments and hospital visits. Her focus slipped for just a moment, and in that instant, disaster struck. Turning too quickly, she bumped into the edge of Edward's table. The tray wobbled, and a full glass of iced water tipped over, splashing onto his impeccable suit. "Oh no!" Claire gasped, her face flushing red with embarrassment. She immediately grabbed a napkin, her hands trembling as she tried to dab at the spreading stain. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean to." Edward's sharp gaze snapped up, his cold demeanor making Claire feel even smaller. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" he said, his tone clipped and unforgiving. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the restaurant. "It was an accident." For a moment, Edward felt his irritation flare. He had come here to escape, not to be drenched in ice water, but as his gaze lingered on Claire, he noticed something: her nervous hands, the strain in her voice, and the exhaustion etched into her features. This wasn't just an incompetent waitress. This was someone clearly carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Forget it," Edward said abruptly, waving off her attempts to clean the mess. "Just go." Claire's shoulders slumped with relief, though she still felt the sting of his words. "Thank you," she murmured, before retreating to the kitchen, wishing the ground would swallow her whole. But Edward couldn't let it go. As the evening wore on, he found his thoughts returning to the young woman. He overheard fragments of her conversation with a coworker near the service station. "I can't miss another shift," Claire said in a hushed tone. "Mom's treatment depends on this paycheck." Edward's interest piqued. He wasn't one to meddle in others' lives, but something about her struck a chord. Perhaps it was the raw determination in her voice, or perhaps it was the haunting familiarity of her desperation. When Claire returned to his table later to clear the dishes, Edward caught her off guard. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice even but firm. She hesitated, unsure of his intentions. "Claire Bennett." "Claire," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "You've had a rough night." "It's just work," she replied with a faint smile, though her eyes betrayed the truth. Edward reached into his pocket and placed several crisp bills on the table, far more than the cost of the meal. "Consider this a tip, and come by my office tomorrow evening. I'd like to discuss something that might be of interest to you." Claire stared at the money, then back at Edward, her confusion evident. "I don't understand." "You will," Edward interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He rose from his seat, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Claire standing there, stunned and uncertain about what she had just walked into. Claire stood outside Edward Harrington's office the following evening, clutching her bag tightly. She wasn't sure why she had agreed to come, but curiosity and desperation had driven her here. The imposing skyscraper loomed above her, a stark reminder of how far removed Edward's world was from her own. When she entered the building, the sleek interior and sharp efficiency of the staff only heightened her nerves. She was led to Edward's private office on the top floor, where the breathtaking view of Los Angeles stretched out behind him like a painting. "Miss Bennett?" Edward greeted her as she stepped inside, gesturing for her to sit. His tone was calm, almost clinical, as though he were about to conduct a business deal. "Mr. Harrington," Claire replied, her voice steady despite the rapid thumping of her heart. "I'm not sure why I'm here, but thank you for the tip." Edward studied her for a moment, his gray eyes sharp and calculating. "I didn't invite you here for gratitude. I have a proposition." Claire tilted her head slightly, her unease growing. "A proposition?" "Yes," Edward said, leaning back in his chair. "You strike me as someone who values honesty, so I'll be direct. I need an heir, someone to carry on my legacy when I'm gone. A child." Claire's eyes widened in disbelief. "A child?" she echoed, stunned by the bluntness of his words. Edward continued, his tone unwavering. "I've lived long enough to know that traditional relationships don't work for me. I've tried love. It's unpredictable and often destructive. But what I need is far simpler. I need someone to bear my child. In exchange, I will provide for you and your family financially for the rest of your life." The room fell silent as Claire struggled to process what he was saying. Are you serious?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. "Completely," Edward replied. "This is not a romantic arrangement, Miss Bennett. It's a practical one. You will play the role of my wife in public and live here for the duration of the pregnancy. After the child is born, you're free to leave with the security and financial stability you'll gain from this arrangement." Claire's mind raced. She thought of her mother, the endless medical bills, and the crushing weight of her daily struggles. On the surface, the offer seemed absurd, but beneath it was the promise of a future she couldn't provide on her own. "And what happens to the child?" Claire asked cautiously. "The child will remain with me," Edward replied. "I'll ensure they have every opportunity to thrive." Claire hesitated, her emotions a storm of confusion, fear, and hope. "Why me?" she asked. Edward's gaze softened, if only slightly. "Because I see in you a strength that's rare. You're determined, resilient, and honest. Qualities I'd want in the mother of my child." Her lips parted to respond, but she stopped herself, overwhelmed by the weight of the decision. It's not something I can decide right away," she said finally. "Take your time," Edward said, his voice calm but firm. "But I won't make this offer again. Think carefully, Miss Bennet. This could change your life and your mother's for the better." Claire left the office that evening with a whirlwind of thoughts swirling in her mind. The offer was surreal, but the promise of financial freedom for her family was undeniable. As she walked through the bustling streets of Los Angeles, she knew one thing for certain: her life would never be the same, no matter what she decided. 2 weeks later, Claire Bennet stood at the gates of Edward Harrington's estate, a sprawling mansion nestled in the hills overlooking Los Angeles. The grandeur of the property was overwhelming: immaculate gardens, towering columns, and an air of elegance that seemed almost surreal. Her decision to accept Edward's proposition hadn't come easily. She had spent sleepless nights weighing the pros and cons, torn between fear of the unknown and the promise of a future without financial burdens. In the end, the image of her mother, frail and confined to a hospital bed, had tipped the scales. A butler greeted her at the entrance, leading her through the pristine marble foyer and into the heart of the mansion. Edward was waiting in the living room, seated in a high-backed chair with his usual composed demeanor. "You're punctual," he remarked, rising to his feet. "I appreciate that." Claire nodded, clutching the strap of her bag tightly. "I thought it was important to start this off on the right foot." Edward gestured for her to sit. "There are a few formalities we need to address before moving forward." Within moments, his lawyer, Marcus Evans, entered the room, carrying a folder filled with documents. Marcus explained the details of the agreement with the precision of someone used to high-stakes negotiations. Claire would act as Edward's wife in public, live in the mansion, and bear his child through artificial insemination. In return, she would receive financial support for her mother's treatment and a significant sum upon the child's birth. Edward remained silent as Marcus outlined the terms, his expression unreadable. Claire, though intimidated, signed the contract, sealing her commitment to the arrangement. The early days of their marriage were awkward and filled with tension. Claire moved into a luxurious guest suite, complete with everything she could possibly need, but the grandeur only made her feel more out of place. Edward maintained his usual stoic demeanor, treating the arrangement as a business transaction rather than a partnership. Meals were often eaten in silence, and their interactions were limited to brief conversations about logistics and schedules. Public appearances, however, were a different story. Edward introduced Claire as his wife at charity galas, business dinners, and other high-profile events. Claire, nervous at first, quickly learned how to navigate the expectations of his social circle. "You carry yourself well," Edward said after one particularly successful evening. "Better than I expected." Claire raised an eyebrow, her voice tinged with sarcasm. "Is that your version of a compliment?" Edward's lips twitched into what could almost be called a smile. Perhaps. Despite the rigid nature of their arrangement, moments of humanity began to surface. Claire noticed Edward's quiet habits, the way he lingered over a cup of coffee in the morning, or spent hours reading in his study. He wasn't as cold as he appeared. There was a depth to him that intrigued her. Likewise, Edward couldn't ignore Claire's presence. Her resilience and adaptability were unlike anyone he had encountered before. She carried the weight of her struggles with grace, and her genuine kindness was a stark contrast to the superficiality he had grown accustomed to in his world. One evening, as Claire returned to the mansion after visiting her mother, she found Edward in the nursery. The room had been recently furnished with care, soft pastel walls, a crib made of polished wood, and a collection of children's books neatly arranged on a shelf. "You did all this?" Claire asked, her voice filled with surprise. Edward glanced at her briefly before turning back to the crib. "It needed to be done. The child deserves a proper space." Claire stepped closer, her heart softening as she saw a glimpse of vulnerability in him. "Thank you," she said quietly. Edward met her gaze, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something warmer in his expression. "You don't need to thank me. This is as much for you as it is for the child." The moment hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that was beginning to form between them. As the weeks passed, Claire found herself growing more comfortable in the mansion. Edward's sharp edges seemed to soften, and their interactions became less formal. They shared quiet dinners where the silences were no longer awkward, but companionable. One night, as they sat by the fireplace, Edward surprised her by sharing a story from his childhood, a rare glimpse into the man behind the facade. "My father used to tell me that success means nothing if you have no one to share it with," he said, his voice low. "I didn't understand what he meant until recently." Claire's heart ached at his honesty, but she chose her words carefully. "Maybe it's not too late to change that." Edward didn't respond, but the look in his eyes suggested that her words had struck a chord. Months passed, and the dynamic between Edward and Claire continued to shift in subtle yet profound ways. Though their arrangement had begun as a cold, calculated agreement, moments of warmth and understanding had started to bloom. One afternoon, the two sat in the waiting room of a prestigious fertility clinic in Beverly Hills. Edward, as composed as ever, glanced at Claire, who was nervously tapping her fingers on the armrest of her chair. "Relax," Edward said, his voice steady but not unkind. "The doctors here are the best. Everything will proceed as planned." Claire shot him a weak smile. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one being poked and prodded." Edward's lips curved slightly at her remark. "Fair enough." Moments later, they were called into an examination room. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with a warm demeanor, greeted them and began the procedure. Claire lay on the examination table, her anxiety palpable despite the doctor's reassuring words. But she promptly felt better and even laughed with her daughters about the expensive exhibit. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor smiled and turned the screen toward them. "Congratulations," she said, her tone bright. "You're pregnant. And there's more good news. There are 2 heartbeats. You're expecting twins." The words hung in the air, echoing in Claire's mind. "Twins?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward's usually stoic expression flickered with something indescribable, shock, joy, perhaps even fear. He stepped closer to the monitor, staring at the tiny flickers of life displayed on the screen. For a man who had spent his life controlling every detail of his existence, this was a moment he couldn't have anticipated. "Yes," the doctor continued, "everything looks perfect. We'll schedule regular checkups to ensure the pregnancy progresses smoothly." The car ride home was unusually quiet. Claire stared out the window, her hand resting gently on her abdomen, while Edward kept his eyes on the road. "You've been awfully quiet," Claire finally said, breaking the silence. Edward's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. "It's a lot to process," he admitted, his voice lower than usual. "For both of us," Claire replied, her tone softer. "But it's real now, isn't it? two lives growing inside me. It's more than just an agreement now." Edward glanced at her briefly before returning his focus to the road. "Yes, it's real." In the weeks that followed, Edward's demeanor began to change. He became more attentive, asking Claire about her health and ensuring she had everything she needed. Though his gestures were subtle, they didn't go unnoticed by Claire. One evening, as Claire sat in the living room reading, Edward walked in with a small box. "What's this?" Claire asked, setting her book aside. "Open it," Edward said, his tone as neutral as ever. Inside the box was a pair of tiny silver bracelets, engraved with the words Harrington Legacy. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she held them. "They're for the twins," Edward said, almost hesitantly. "Something to remind them of where they come from." Claire's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Finally she managed, "Thank you. This means a lot." Edward nodded, his expression unreadable, but the faintest trace of warmth lingered in his eyes. As the pregnancy progressed, Claire felt the bond between her and Edward deepening. She saw glimpses of the man he rarely allowed the world to see, a man capable of tenderness and vulnerability. For Edward, the reality of becoming a father was beginning to sink in. Each time he saw Claire place a hand on her growing belly or speak softly to the unborn twins, he felt something stir within him, an unfamiliar but welcome sense of hope. The arrangement that had once been built on practicality was transforming into something far more profound, though neither of them was ready to fully acknowledge it just yet. The mansion, once a cold and lifeless space, began to transform alongside the growing lives within Claire. It was subtle at first, a vase of fresh flowers on the dining table, soft lullabies echoing from the nursery. But these changes were a reflection of something deeper, something neither Edward nor Claire could fully articulate. Claire's pregnancy brought a sense of warmth and vitality to Edward's meticulously ordered world. Despite his attempts to maintain emotional distance, he found himself drawn to the quiet moments shared with her. Late at night, he would catch glimpses of her reading baby books in the study, or humming softly as she folded tiny clothes for the twins. One morning, Edward walked into the nursery, his eyes scanning the room Claire had lovingly arranged. The walls were painted a gentle shade of green, the cribs neatly placed side by side. A mobile of stars and moons hung above them, spinning slowly in the soft morning light. "You've been busy," Edward remarked, his tone unusually gentle. Claire looked up from where she was placing stuffed animals on a shelf. "I couldn't wait any longer," she admitted with a small smile. "It feels real now, and I want everything to be perfect for them." Edward approached one of the cribs, running his hand along the polished wood. "You've done well," he said, his voice quiet. "They'll have everything they need." Claire hesitated before responding. "Edward, it's not just about what they have. It's about what they feel. They'll need love more than anything else." Edward met her gaze, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. He nodded but didn't reply, retreating back into his composed demeanor. As the weeks went by, Edward's gestures became more thoughtful. One evening, he surprised Claire with a special dinner in the garden. The table was set under a canopy of twinkling fairy lights, the aroma of freshly cooked dishes wafting through the air. "What's all this?" Claire asked, her eyes wide with surprise. Edward pulled out a chair for her, his expression calm but sincere. "You've been through a lot. I thought you deserved a moment to relax." Claire sat down, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Edward. This is unexpected." As they ate, their conversation flowed more freely than it ever had before. Edward spoke of his childhood, his struggles to live up to his father's expectations, and his fears of leaving behind a legacy that felt incomplete. Claire listened intently, her empathy shining through in every word she offered. "You've achieved so much, Edward. But maybe legacy isn't just about what you leave behind. Maybe it's about who you share it with while you're here. Her words lingered with him long after the dinner ended. Edward's growing attachment to Claire and the twins became increasingly evident. He began joining her for evening walks around the estate, his usual guarded demeanor softening as they talked about their hopes and fears. One particularly memorable evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Claire paused near a bench overlooking the city. She placed her hands on her growing belly, a serene smile on her face. "They're kicking," she said, looking up at Edward. Hesitating for a moment, Edward reached out, his hand hovering just above her stomach. "May I?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically unsure. "Please return this way to join the group." Claire nodded, guiding his hand to where the twins' tiny movements could be felt. Edward's eyes widened slightly as he felt the soft flutters beneath his palm. "It's incredible," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire smiled, her eyes meeting his. "They already know you," she said softly. "You're going to be an amazing father." Edward didn't reply, but the emotion in his eyes spoke volumes. The walls Edward had built around himself were beginning to crack. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to feel, not just for the twins, but for Claire. She had become more than just the mother of his children. She had become someone he admired, someone he trusted, and perhaps someone he cared for more than he was willing to admit. Likewise, Claire found herself drawn to Edward in ways she hadn't expected. Beneath his stoic exterior was a man capable of immense kindness and vulnerability. She could see it in the way he looked at the nursery, the way he protected her, and the way he was beginning to let her into his world. The arrangement that had once been purely transactional was now evolving into something far deeper. A connection neither of them had anticipated, but both were beginning to embrace. The warm rhythm that had settled between Claire and Edward began to fray, as the weight of their unspoken emotions and the rigid terms of their arrangement loomed over them. Though they had grown closer, the shadow of the contract and its implications hung between them like an unspoken barrier. One evening, as Claire walked down the hall toward the nursery, she overheard voices coming from Edward's study. The door was slightly ajar, and she paused when she recognized the clipped tone of his lawyer, Marcus Evans. "You need to ensure everything remains on track," Marcus said firmly. "The contract explicitly states that Miss Bennet will leave after the birth of the twins. No entanglements, no changes." Edward's response was quieter, but no less resolute. "I'm aware of the terms, Marcus, but things are different now." "Different?" Marcus's voice held a note of disbelief. "Edward, this was supposed to be a business arrangement. You can't let emotions cloud your judgment." Claire's heart sank as she leaned against the wall, the words cutting deeper than she expected. Had she been naive to believe there was something more between them? She turned away and headed to her room, her mind racing. That night, sleep eluded her as doubts crept in. Perhaps Edward had simply been kind because of the twins, because of his obligation. Maybe he still saw her as nothing more than a part of the deal. The next morning, Claire confronted Edward in the dining room. He was reading the paper, his coffee steaming on the table beside him. "We need to talk," Claire said, her voice steady but edged with tension. Edward looked up, setting the paper aside. "What's on your mind?" "I overheard your conversation with Marcus," she said bluntly, "about the contract, about me leaving after the twins are born." Edward's jaw tightened, and he sighed. "Claire, I didn't mean for you to hear that." "But I did," she pressed. "And now I need to know, what do I really mean to you, Edward? Am I just the person carrying your heirs, or am I something more?" Edward's expression was unreadable, but the hesitation in his response spoke volumes. "This arrangement was never supposed to be about feelings," he said carefully. "It was supposed to be simple." Claire's heart ached at his words. "And what about now? Is it still simple for you?" Edward stood, his imposing figure towering over her. but his voice was soft. No, it's not simple anymore. For a moment they stood in silence, the tension between them almost unbearable. Finally Claire spoke, her voice trembling. I can't keep doing this, Edward. I can't stay here if I'm just a part of your plan. I've been honest with you from the start, and I deserve the same honesty in return. Edward reached out as if to stop her from leaving the room, but his hand hovered in the air before falling back to his side. I need time, Claire, he admitted, his voice low. This is new for me. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. You've had time, Edward. Maybe it's time I take mine. The next few days were filled with an unbearable quiet. Claire spent most of her time in the nursery, avoiding Edward while he buried himself in work, though his mind was clearly elsewhere. One evening, as he stood in his study staring out at the city lights, Edward replayed her words in his mind. I can't stay here if I'm just a part of your plan. He realized how deeply she had come to mean to him, not just as the mother of his children, but as someone who had brought light and warmth into his life. Edward clenched his fists, frustration and regret coursing through him. He had spent his life building walls to protect himself, only to realize that those very walls now kept him from what mattered most. Meanwhile, Claire began packing her belongings, uncertain if she could continue living under the same roof as Edward without clarity about their future. Each step she took away from the life they had built together felt heavier than the last. As she zipped her suitcase, a knock came at the door. Edward stood in the doorway, his usually composed face betraying a storm of emotions. Don't go, he said, his voice wry. Claire turned to face him, her eyes searching his. Why should I stay, Edward? Tell me one good reason. Edward stepped closer, his gaze locking with hers. Because I need you. Not just for the twins, not just for this arrangement. I need you. Claire's breath caught as she saw the vulnerability in his eyes, a vulnerability he had hidden for so long. I've spent my entire life avoiding love because I was afraid of the pain it could bring, Edward continued. But losing you would be the greatest pain of all. Tears welled in Claire's eyes, and for the first time in days, a glimmer of hope sparked between them. The tension that had settled between Edward and Claire dissolved in the wake of an unexpected call. Early one morning, as the mansion was still cloaked in darkness, Claire stood at the top of the grand staircase, clutching her belly. Edward, she called out, her voice trembling with both pain and urgency. Within moments, Edward appeared at the base of the stairs, his usually composed demeanor replaced by visible concern. What's wrong? He asked, hurrying to her side. It's time, Claire gasped, wincing as another contraction hit. Edward didn't hesitate. Scooping her into his arms, he carried her to the waiting car, his mind racing faster than the wheels of the sleek black sedan as they sped toward the hospital. Breathe, Claire, he urged, his voice calm despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. You're strong. You've got this. Claire glanced at him through her pain, seeing a rare vulnerability in his expression. Don't leave me, she whispered, clutching his hand. I won't, Edward replied, his voice steady. I'll be right here. Hours later, in the sterile yet bustling delivery room, Claire fought through the pain of labor. Edward remained by her side, holding her hand tightly, his heart pounding as he watched her endure the exhausting process of bringing their children into the world. Just one more push, the doctor said encouragingly. Claire let out a cry of determination, and moments later, the first baby's wail echoed through the room. It's a boy, the nurse announced, carefully placing the newborn into the waiting arms of a pediatric specialist. Edward's throat tightened as he caught his first glimpse of his son, tiny, fragile, and perfect. Before he could fully absorb the moment, another cry filled the room. And here's your daughter, the nurse said, lifting the second baby. Claire collapsed back onto the bed, tears streaming down her face as she looked at Edward. We did it, she whispered, her voice filled with awe and exhaustion. Edward, for the first time in years, felt tears well in his eyes. He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to Claire's forehead. "You were incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. After the chaos of the delivery subsided, the hospital room grew quiet. Claire lay in bed, holding their twins, one in each arm. Edward sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the tiny lives they had brought into the world. "They're perfect," Claire murmured, her voice filled with wonder as she gently touched the boy's tiny fingers. Edward reached out, placing a hand on the girl's head, her soft hair barely visible beneath the swaddle. "They are," he agreed, his voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, the room was filled with nothing but the soft coos of the babies and the quiet hum of monitors. But as joy filled the room, Claire's face clouded with hesitation. She looked down at the twins, her tears no longer ones of happiness alone. "What's wrong?" Edward asked, noticing the change in her expression. Claire's voice trembled as she spoke. "The contract," she said. "I agreed to leave after they were born. I can't leave them, Edward. I love them. She stopped herself, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Edward's heart clenched at her confession. He reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice resolute. Claire looked at him, hope and uncertainty battling in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Edward stood, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket, the contract that had defined their relationship from the start. Without hesitation, he tore it in half, the sound breaking the stillness of the room. "I don't care about the contract anymore," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. "All I care about is you. You and these two beautiful children. You're my family now, Claire. Stay, not because of any agreement, but because you want to." Tears spilled down Claire's cheeks as she nodded, overwhelmed by his words. "I want to," she whispered. "I want us to be a family." Edward leaned down, resting his forehead against hers. "We already are." Weeks turned into months, and the once cold mansion transformed into a home filled with warmth and life. The soft cries of the twins echoed through the halls, their giggles soon replacing the quiet that had once defined the estate. Edward Harrington, the man who had spent a lifetime building walls around his heart, was now completely captivated by his new role as a father. His mornings began with feeding the twins and learning the art of diaper changes, a task he approached with a determination that amused Claire. "You're getting better at this," Claire teased one morning, as Edward fumbled with the snaps of the baby's onesie. "Practice makes perfect," Edward replied, his voice light, a rare but welcome change from his usual seriousness. Claire watched him with a smile, marveling at how far they had come. The man who once insisted their arrangement be devoid of emotion now sang lullabies to their children and spent hours watching them sleep. One evening, Edward stepped out onto the terrace where Claire sat cradling the twins. The soft glow of the sunset bathed the scene in golden light, and Edward paused, struck by the serenity of the moment. "I love being out here," Claire said, looking up as Edward approached. "They're not the only ones," Edward replied, sitting beside her. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the twins dozing peacefully in Claire's arms. Finally, Edward spoke, his tone reflective. "Claire," he began, "when I first made that proposition to you, I thought I was solving a problem. I thought an heir would complete my legacy, that it would be the final piece of my life's puzzle." He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But I was wrong. My legacy isn't just about these children. It's about you. About us." Claire's breath hitched as she turned to him. "I didn't realize how much I needed you," Edward continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You've shown me a life I never knew I could have, a life filled with love, not just obligation. And for that, I'll be forever grateful." Tears welled in Claire's eyes as she reached for his hand. "You gave me something I never thought I'd have either," she said softly. "A home, a family, and someone to share it with." The months that followed were filled with milestones: the twins' first smiles, their first giggles, and their first attempts at rolling over. Each moment brought Edward and Claire closer, solidifying the bond that had grown between them. One afternoon, as they sat in the nursery playing with the twins, Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Claire's heart skipped a beat as he opened it to reveal a delicate diamond ring. "Claire Bennett," Edward began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you've already given me more than I ever deserved, but I want to give you everything I have in return. Will you marry me? Not as part of an arrangement, but as the woman I love." Claire's eyes filled with tears, her hand trembling as she reached for his. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with joy. "1,000 times yes." Edward slid the ring onto her finger, and as the twins babbled happily between them, they shared a kiss filled with all the love and promise of the family they had become. The story came full circle on a crisp autumn day when Edward and Claire stood in the garden of the mansion, surrounded by close friends and family. Their wedding was a simple, intimate affair, but it was filled with warmth and joy. As Edward looked at Claire holding their twins in her arms, he felt a peace he had never known. His life, once defined by ambition and solitude, was now enriched by love and laughter. In his vows, Edward summed up the journey they had taken together. "I thought I needed a legacy to feel complete. What I truly needed was a family, to make life worth living. You've given me that, Claire. You've given me everything." Claire smiled, her eyes shimmering with tears, and replied, "You've shown me that love can heal even the deepest wounds. Together, we've built something beautiful." As they exchanged rings and sealed their vows with a kiss, the twins cooed softly in the background, a reminder of the love that had brought them all together. Later that evening, Edward and Claire sat by the fireplace, the twins asleep in their nursery. The warmth of the fire mirrored the warmth in their hearts as they held hands, reflecting on how far they had come. The camera panned out to show the lively mansion, no longer just a symbol of wealth, but a home filled with love and hope. Edward's voice narrated the final words. "Love isn't something you can plan or control. It finds you when you least expect it and changes everything. In the end, it's not wealth or power that defines us. It's the people we choose to share our lives with, and I've chosen mine."